from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow, where she is also Director of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. Julie's done lots of interesting work in recent years around public and private policing, the kind of governance of ecological harm, and she's set up this kind of global research group on small island security governance, and on the whole question of kind of protecting harmscapes is the subject of her talk today. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for attending. I'm happy to see so many of you here. So my talk is really kind of exploring my own research pathway, if you like, in terms of just focusing on everyday climate harmscapes. And I'll tell you later on what I mean by harmscapes. And I want to end off on a kind of positive note, because anything related to climate change obviously tends to get a bit depressing. So I'm looking kind of for an assemblages of care response to everyday climate harms. So that is my focus. And essentially it's just how climate change related crises have for many people in various contexts become part of their everyday. And how has that impacted on their local governance practices or responses? So that's kind of the work that I've been doing. How has the kind of everyday climate harms impacted on people? And what are they doing about it, basically? And it's also kind of exploring, basically, can criminology help us to engage with this? What are the criminological pathways to explore this kind of empirical focus that's happening now? So it's kind of a lines of flight approach and kind of the prospects potentially in assemblages of care governance response, which I'm proposing at the end. So, I mean, the presentation is fairly simple. It's three kind of focal areas. Firstly, I'm going to explain what do I mean by governing everyday crisis. Then I'm going to take you down kind of the road of where criminology is focusing on. What are the lines of flight in criminology that we can draw from? And then I'm going to end off with kind of assemblages of care. What does that mean? And so firstly, what do I mean by governing everyday crisis? So I've got a lot of inspiration that I'm drawing from in terms of the work of Crawford and Hutchinson in terms of their everyday security. And I find that kind of inspiration because that's what I'm looking at. But I'm putting a climate lens on it, right? So it's really, and I've taken some quotes for them. It's like the normal, regularized, and prevailing nature of insecurity for some people in particular environments. I mean, that's just perfect for what I'm looking at, but I'm, again, a climate lens on that. So they look at how people are affected by security projects and processes, but also how people manage their daily security, right? So it's how do they govern their own security? And it could be sundry, mundane, quotidian routines and practices. So I'm not actually looking at kind of the extraordinary. And that's really got to do with the fact that much of criminology looks at the extraordinary, don't we? Colleagues of mine at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research were looking at criminology of everyday life, the mundane, the routine, not the exceptional, the spectacular, the extraordinary. What happens if climate harms become part of your routine, become mundane? And so I'm looking at kind of the gradual, cumulative climate harms versus kind of the short, sudden disaster, climate-related disaster. And of course, what is also useful about everyday security is that there's this, there's a conceptual paper in terms of how we frame this, but just picking out from their paper, there's a kind of spatial and temporal aspect to it, which I also will draw on as I go through this in the presentation. And there's also an aspect of emotions, anxiety, fear, obviously, in terms of the security practices that we employ in our everyday life, right? So there's an emotional aspect to that, which will also come up later in this presentation. So you see that everyday security has really kind of inspired me along the way in terms of how to frame a governance response to everyday crises. And so governing everyday crisis is just the governing aspect of it, and it's the lived experience, really. of climate change, everyday mitigation and governance. And this positions this focus not on kind of these broader strategies and tactics at institutional level. It's looking at a kind of a people-centric approach. So this is something I've been working on as well, is a paper that I did for Oxford, now I realize it was 2 years ago, on a normalized crisis. It's something I've thought about. And I suppose it's a personal experience which made me think about this whole thing, right? And I'll give you that personal experience so you know where I'm coming from. So before I moved to the UK, which is now 7.5 years ago, I used to live in South Africa, and there was a major drought. We were just going to run out of water. There was no plan B. D-Day was this date. I mean, Australia was also going through a drought at the time, and they got tankers of water in. South Africa had no plan at all. And so as the months rolled by, this crisis became normalized. It became part of our everyday practices of saving water, making sure taps weren't running, of all sorts of practices employed over and above our other security practices, because South Africa is not a safe space. So it just became part of our everyday crises. So that kind of inspired me, and I'm not alone in this. There are other people experiencing crises as kind of normal, part of their everyday. And so I kind of came up with this framing to understand climate harms in many contexts as the new normal. It's routinized, your practices change, it becomes embedded, and it might even be mundane. And I'm not talking about that in this presentation, but I'm also thinking about how do you then decolonize the mundane? What does mundane mean? What does mundane mean here, as opposed to contexts where they experience normalized crisis? But that's another story. And so I'm looking at kind of how climate harms have just converged with other harms, especially if it's felt on that everyday level. And it's just another layer. So it's not something exceptional out there, it's part of a kind of a layered experience of insecurity. And what we were also finding, and this is why I'm interested in this, why I feel like this is a criminological problem, is that a lot of the practices to deal with it were the same practices used to deal with other harms, crimes, violence. It's the same security governance tactics to deal with climate harms. More of the same. So this is from a paper that Clifford Shearing and I wrote about just employing more of the same types of tactics to deal with everyday climate harm. So we focused on, for instance, climate gating. And so you have an image there of a luxury security estate in South Africa, because that's where many of the climate harms are happening as well, where gating is now infused with the climate sensibility. So it's the same practice, but now you are gating against climate harms. You're protecting yourself against climate harms. You're creating a lifestyle estate, a village to protect yourself by having your own water supplies, for instance. All sorts of tactics and techniques. And it also relates to kind of Lamb et al.'s focus on bunkerization. Again, a kind of a bunkering tactic to protect oneself against climate harms. And so, of course, these are all globally relevant, but of course, much of this is prevalent in global south contexts. But as climate change impacts progress, it'll become more and more relevant, I suspect, to global north contexts. And so I just want to position myself as not focusing on that. And there's a wonderful literature on policing disaster. My colleagues Ali Malik, Jared Blausen, etc. have focused on this, specifically on law enforcement and public police as first responders to disaster. And it's a lot been around specific events, fires, drought, flood, it's hurricanes, etc. They're also very interested in coordination, collaborative arrangements around that. They're also interested in recovery and resilience, and of course there's a focus on resilience policing in this regard. So it's like more of a policing focus and more of a once-off disaster, because a reoccurring once-off disaster. And so I've taken this, I've poached this quote from Harrington and Shearing's book. It security in the Anthropocene, I'm interested in kind of the slow violence of climate change harms. And I think this quote is really, it's a bit depressing, but it's the basic attunement of the Anthropocene is anxiety. Again, there's the emotion, which is precisely the feeling of the loss of the world, the end of the world, but not as we thought, a great bang or a void, but a prolongation of things in synchrony. So it's a long process with the disappearance of meaningful backdrop and thus the disappearance of the foreground. So it's not that big bang moment, it's actually the slow violence, a slow burn. So what have been criminology's lines of flight that I have drawn on? So the key question, what are the pathways, what are ontologies that we can draw on to explore everyday climate harmscapes, right? And of course this is not exhaustive, I recognize there's a lot out there, but these are kind of my inspirations, if you like, to explore this topic. And of course climate change criminology has been kind of inspirational by Rob White. And I feel like I'm going to lecture you on this, but I want you to see the foundations which criminology has already been dealing with. And it's surprising, it's a nice surprise to see criminological engagement with this already. And so it's a recognition of that global interconnectedness, eco-justice. It recognizes human, non-human connections, which will come out later in the presentation as well. It's not just a human issue or human problem. It recognizes the planetary scale, so there's a spatial aspect to this. It's transboundary, of course, it's global, it's planetary. It transcends a particular response. It transcends a particular nation-state response, for instance, or a legal response, or a criminal response. That's where I'm getting to. And of course, it recognizes the environment is also kind of a victim in this, which I'll also go into. And of course, it recognizes the causes. And the causes are just as important as the governance responses. And if the causes are anthropocentric, what are the governance responses going to be? Do we tie into our usual human governance responses in this regard, if it's caused by humans in the first place? If it's tied into kind of colonial and imperialist and capitalist practices, we're stuck in the system. Do we then employ that very system to deal with the problem? So of course there's a recognition then, of, it's just a neo-colonial capitalist movement that's put us into this position in the first place. It's also recognizing that consequences can be criminogenic. So there's a big focus on crimes and criminalization. And of course, potentially catastrophic. And there's a victimology component, which I'll look at in I think, the next slide. And of course, there's an understanding of the powers and interests that inform this. Very often state corporate interests that kind of shape where we are now, which makes us think, well, what are the governance responses going to be in that regard? Of course, there are various discourses around, anti-climate change discourses as well. We realize that it's systemic. There's a huge amount of inequality. So there's a long story around, the social justice implications of climate change, which a climate change criminology recognizes. And there's a call from a climate change criminology perspective for social action, agitation, and a public criminology. And the person who wrote the book on public criminology is sitting over there, so I'm not going to go into that. You can answer any questions about public criminology. So again, it's kind of this climate victimology, and what's very useful again is understanding, of course, the disproportionality of this. Who is the most affected by climate change? It's the poor, the disadvantaged, the vulnerable, certain racial ethnic groups. Of course, it's geographically specific, right? Indigenous communities are mostly affected by this, and also non-human environmental entities, ecosystems, kind of non-living entities, fauna, animal life, flora, vegetation. So it recognizes, it incorporates a non-human aspect. So this already stretches our usual criminological understanding of victimology to including non-human entities, non-human animals into it. And that I'll go into again when I'll go into further slides about post-humanism. And so humans and non-humans are exploited. Again, it's kind of incorporating the non-human aspect to this. Also, what I found useful with the climate change criminology is the the fact that the victimization is universal. We're all going to suffer from this, some more than others, hence the differential victimization. And there's a temporal aspect to that. Some are already suffering. So a spatial and temporal aspect to victimization and who's victimized. And of course, there's a huge, again, social injustice underpinning this, that those who are least responsible and most effective, and ironically get the most targeted to do something about it. So I was looking through kind of funding applications or funding grants or funding prospects, I can't remember what it was. And one of them was to apply for funding to make sure that Kenya's industry was in line with a sustainable... Kenya, really? You know, it's like targeting industries that are least responsible. So there's also an inequality around pressurizing those who are the least offending. So it's injustice in many ways, in other words. And so a climate change criminology proposes certain governance responses, which I will say, well, let me just tell you what they are. First of all, there's the desire for ecocide to become kind of akin to an international criminal court. Ecocide as a kind of an international crime. So it's to criminalize environmental harm. It's also to kind of ensure that legal systems are in place, legal reform, environmental legislation, law enforcement agencies, etc., etc. It's a lot of focus around courts and adjudication, special courts, making special courts, like I said, an international criminal court for ecocide. Also social regulation, of course, to reform those modes of production and consumption. There's an activist component, a public criminology component, as I mentioned. And then there's a policing aspect, hence the picture, who police disasters. And to be honest, I don't think any of this has any relevance, should I say whatsoever, in many global south contexts at all, where the main person who's dealing with IUU fishing off the coast of Zanzibar is one law enforcement guy in a dinghy, using my colleague Annette Hoopscher's example. What does that mean, right? So climate change criminology has helped a lot, but it's also helped me to see, of course, there are governance gaps here in terms of what can be reasonably appropriate or achievable in certain contexts where the harms are already there, they're already happening, and they're already usually damaging. So then I moved on to Southern Green criminology, and most of this is through David Goyer's work. And of course, it's also, again, this recognition of systemic injustice. The roots of climate change is through colonial, imperial, and capitalist legacies. That has created the climate crisis. Human greed, resource extraction, and the need to kind of move from those systems to systems which are not that way. And of course, it's continued. There's a thin veil between colonialism and neocolonialism. It's just this very same resource extraction happening all the time in any way. And of course, global south contexts are kind of victims in many respects, but also complicit in this, in terms of the quest for resources and the deals, the global deals that happen around us. And of course, this has a disproportionate impact, again, as recognized by Southern Green criminology, of certain southern contexts. And again, as does climate change criminology, recognizes the systemic inequality and structural injustice. So it's a systemic issue. And all this is leading somewhere, because if it's a systemic issue, can you police climate change? Right? So what is also very important is, which Southern Green criminology also brings up, is the epistemological question, which has governance implications. How are you going to govern something if you buy into certain epistemology, if you buy into certain knowledge? So knowledge is very important. And a Southern Green perspective would favour the balancing of knowledges, taking into account Southern knowledges, making sure Southern knowledges are represented. Again, where the most harms are happening right now. Shouldn't those voices then be heard? A post-colonial framing would reject this, would say, no, we don't need a balance. Southern perspectives need to be in and of themselves valued and important. Why should it be pitched against Northern? So that's a more radical version, in other words. Instead of a balancing of North-South knowledge, Southern knowledge should get on with it, and Northern knowledge should decolonize. So that's a post-colonial perspective. So it's a more radical version of that. And Harry Blagg has been the proponent of that. Of course, Goyes also points out the epistemological blindness and epistemological colonialism, ignoring, for instance, indigenous knowledge systems, or actively suppressing them in favor of other knowledges. And I mean, you know yourself, academia is rooted in that. Certain knowledges are favored over other knowledges. That's nothing new. So if most of the harm is happening in the Global South, you cannot be blind to Global South experiences and knowledges where innovations are happening because they have to already, because the harm is already happening there. But yet we still buy into kind of the belief that Western or Northern knowledge is somehow better. And criminology tends to kind of perpetuate that, according to kind of a Southern Green criminology approach, and for those actually who want to decolonize criminology and abolish it altogether. So they also, this is the decolonization component of this. It challenges the universality of Western social knowledge. How can Western theories then theorize climate change issues that are happening in the Global South without having experienced that? Are those theories appropriate? So hence, kind of again, the post-colonial move to abandon Northern knowledge altogether because it's just simply not appropriate, or to try to balance, to try to accommodate theories. I mean, many kind of post-colonial criminologists see that as kind of, just being complicit in kind of imperialist knowledge systems. So again, there's still a challenge. Can Western social theory account for very context-specific events happening in the Global South related to climate harmscapes? And of course, it's absolutely empirical, absolutely important to have the empirical knowledge of indigenous people and local communities. That's kind of a primary focus of Southern Green criminology. And multicultural knowledge is not to disavow any knowledges, but to, again, balance that knowledge out, according to, again, the Southern Green criminology focus. So what I've also found inspirational from Southern Green criminology, it's criticism of what's happening now in terms of how we deal with climate change, which I've kind of alluded to already, in terms of our favouring of a climate apartheid, our favouring of same old security governance practices of gating and bunkering, and our climate adaptation isn't very much of an adaptation, it's more like a perverse adaptation, according to Brisman. So we're just using the same old tactics to deal with this planetary harm. And of course, we know this. I mean, most of these practices are class and race-based, and it ties into practices of immigration, it ties into practices of securitization. We're dealing with climate harms becomes a criminal and security exercise. And it's just making those who are vulnerable even more vulnerable by othering them. They become the problem, they become a security threat. Whereas the movement from south to north to kind of escape, for instance, climate harms, is due to the very problem that northern systems created in the first place. And it's not acknowledging that in terms of the kind of the resource extraction, neocolonialism, and then kind of othering and criminalizing and securitizing those groups trying to escape the harm in the first place. So there's a kind of a criminal selectivity, criminalize the vulnerable, a criminal response, in other words, to a climate harm. And what I find interesting, kind of a tag on Southern Green criminology, is mention made of an ethics of care versus a punishment, versus securitization and criminalization. So then this led me off. Now I'm moving on to something else. Security of care. And this is from Harrington and Shearing's book, Security in the Anthropocene. where they take the focus of care to another level. So what is an ethics of care then? So what is the opposite of securization, criminalization, and punishment? A care response. So I found this very interesting in terms of the fact that, of course, care has feminist origins, but now they're applying it to security, but to a positive security, not a negative security. And, I can't really do justice to what they're focusing on in this amount of time, but so I've just taken a quote. So the Anthropocene obliges us to see security as a way to act in relations to others in curious and creative ways. You have to be adaptable and innovative. You can't rely on your old governance framings or systems. To act with care, to be careful and careful. In this spirit, we may then begin privileging alternative forms of positive security that are imminent, emergent, and speculative. So in other words, it's calling for kind of innovation in the face of the fact that our gating and our bunkering and our climate apartheid and our securitization and criminalization is not really going to solve anything in terms of the nature of this problem. And so security of care is contextually specific. It has to be. It's about ethos rather than ethic, and that's something I'll go into again later. An ethos, a sensibility, a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of approaching the world, a lens, rather than ethic, which is a kind of a rule. It has global and local linkages, recognizes the linkages of kind of planetary harm with the household. They talk a lot about biology, the biological, the human as kind of part of a biological assemblage, as well as the human as a kind of a geological actor in a planetary assemblage. We're intimately tied to how Earth systems move and up and shift and change. We know that now, so we have to change our framing. And so there's also kind of a post-humanism that underpins this. An ecological post-humanism. I'm not going into the philosophy of post-humanism. I just want to draw out some, again, inspirations, which Harrington and Shearing and others have focused on in terms of an ecological post-humanism. So, of course, there is related again to kind of climate change, climate harms. There's a criticism of humanism as being deeply anthropocentric. It justifies violence against anything that's less than human. And it has colonial underpinnings, of course, in terms of what is rational. It feeds into that epistemological blindness, the epistemological colonialism, where anything not rational, not seen as rational, is suppressed. Indigenous populations. So I Googled kind of humanism image, and I got this image on the left, which is kind of the epitome of what humanism is. The male at the top, white European, women are on the second rung next to the whale. and everything else is below that. I thought, wow, doesn't that represent some of the things that are happening in this world? So that's where we are. I mean, it's also a disconnect, as if humans are just extracting resources that is endless. And of course we know it's over 7 billion people in the world, its resources are no longer endless. And now we know, of course, that we're intimately connected to that system. So a post-humanism perspective, I mean, ecological thinking, now that we're aware of this, the real impact of climate harm, the Anthropocene, it disturbs what it means to be human. It has to. We have to rethink what it means to be human now, surely, and what it means to be secure, given what I've just told you about everyday harmscapes. What does it now mean to be secure when your livelihood is being disrupted and your way of living is being impacted on by climate harm, by a non-human actant, right? The importance of indigenous cosmologies, again, so vital. We've always seen this connection. We've always seen these assemblages. But of course, again, this epistemological colonialism, colonial times denying that is not rational, as being primitive or uncivilized, denying this knowledge. And of course, humanism is just a series of dominant subject-object. Human is a subject and object is everything else. But actually it's now very much fuzzy because we're so interconnected. And of course, Post-humanism feeds into kind of the post-colonial discourses, decolonization, and also indigenous criminology, again related to specific knowledges and the recognition of human, non-human assemblages. And as an aside, there's also a movement to post-disciplinarity related to what I was talking about in terms of the post-colonial. We should move away from disciplinary boundaries altogether. There shouldn't be a criminology. We are stuck in our boundaries. So that's kind of a radical, radical approach. Move away from disciplines altogether to be able to fully engage with alternative epistemologies, especially related to kind of Bika Oguzina's work around decolonizing criminology, where criminology has always been complicit with imperial knowledges. And again, the movement to abolish criminology altogether. But I'm sticking with criminology for now, hence the lines of flight. So what have the governance directions been, kind of in a nutshell, right? They've been shifting discourses. We recognize, obviously, in criminology that securitization is not the answer. We need a peacemaking criminology. We've moved from anthropocentric to ecocentric. I mean, there's a massive green criminology movement that's really grown exponentially over the years. And we are recognizing our human kind of environment, non-human animal interconnectedness. There's, of course, the focus on mitigation and adaptation. I mean, that's kind of prevalent in the whole climate change engagement. How do you kind of mitigate? How do you deal with the factors that cause climate change in the first place? Versus how do you cope with those changes now? What do you have to do to adapt to them? But essentially, Brisbane causes kind of a wicked problem. Climate change is a wicked problem. I mean, it's underpinned by economic, environmental, political, and social aspects. There's no silver bullet, although we'd like to believe there is one. There isn't something that's just going to stop this. There's not a technical solution out there that we just need to harness and everything will be okay. And we can't stick to our traditional forms of governance. We need a clumsy solution. I like that, a clumsy solution, which is a mixture of stuff. Policies, principles, paradigms. I'm not dismissing courts and law and all of that. I'm just saying we need to be able to adapt to the context, right? We can't have a one-size-fits-all. We can't have a universalistic social theory like a Western theory that just solve all of this, right? Or Western normative policy. It's not going to work this way. So there's virtue in the security of care, and I thought it was great to kind of extend it. It does acknowledge that it can't solve those underlying problems. It's not a mitigation tactic. That hopefully still is happening, still needs to happen. It can't solve those power disparities. It can't solve kind of corporate colonization of nature. And it is to acknowledge, of course, that the Anthropocene brings us in many ways to the end of security. It's to acknowledge that if something isn't done, then what are we, this is kind of catastrophic. This is a catastrophic moment where no amount of security is going to solve it. So it's to acknowledge that. But what can be done here and now for those who are already suffering from the impacts of climate harms, climate change? Okay, this is where I get into assemblages of care approach. And this is kind of my table, so it's a work in progress, so please be kind. Of course, I've got on the one side of assemblages of care, and I've kind of pitched it against what we use in criminology mostly, what we focus on so much, criminal justice securitization, and those strategies that we tend to, as a human species, tend to adopt. Criminal justice system seems to be the solution for so many things, as you know. It's alienating. It's involved in punishment. It's standard or rule orientated, so it's not really context specific, and it's exclusionary. It's meant to exclude, to imprison, punish, to stop at the border. Whereas assemblages of care, it's recognizing the intimacy. You're not alienated from the harm. The harm is part of your everyday. How do you engage with that? Your knowledge about the harm is very important, so why should you be alienated from that knowledge? It's about care as opposed to punishment, a care response to help, to assist. And again, it's about that sensibility, that ethos of compassion, humility, gratitude. And this is where the emotions come in. The everyday security is to recognize that. And it's about belonging and solidarity, so that at the end of the day, the problem is solved not through exclusion or gating or some sort of punishment. It's through actually being part of something going forward, not to extract an othered person. And then how do you police the climate? So it also to acknowledge that there isn't kind of an object to be policed or securitized. It's to recognize that you're dealing with non-human elements here. How do you arrest the ocean? Right? So I've got 4 kind of principles that I've come up with Annette Hupschle. First of all, it stems from this idea to decolonize. We need to decolonize our discourse and practices. And it's a north and south issue, right? We need to kind of, without decolonizing, we're stuck in our same old systems of governance. We're limiting the possibilities of engaging with this innovatively. And decolonizing our discourses and practices, help us to understand the empirical realities of the South. So you don't come there with a normative framing of what to expect or how to act on a problem without understanding the problem. And so this is from a paper that I did with Annette Hupschle on Southern Blue Criminology. We introduced this framing. So I'm drawing from that paper where we came up with principles related to ocean harmscapes, but I think these principles are pertinent across the board. And they're principles, they're not practices. Of course, I'm not going to give practices. This is what you need to do. They have to be principles. They have to be not specific to any context. They're ways of thinking. They're sensibilities. They're a framework of action, and then the practices will be different wherever you go. The whole point is not to have a universalistic approach to this problem. So they're principles, they're ideas, they're sensibilities. And the first one is really to move from a crime-centric framing. I mean, there is space for it, but normatively, to turn everything into a crime or a crime response is probably not helpful. To normatively have that as your starting point. And you need to be open to kind of like this idea of climate harmscapes, and this is where I delve into this concept of harmscapes. And this is something that Clifford Shearing and I came up with in a 2018 article. And it's just really a contraction of harm landscapes. And it's kind of signals harms as not one-off events, but actually kind of multi-dimensional. A conflation of harm landscapes, crime, ecological degradation, structural injustices, intersecting. And it recognizes that harms are kind of converging. It's not just a criminal harm. It's a kind of ecological, structural, socio-material harms. So it's trying to stretch the idea of harms within criminology. And I've taken this quote again from Annette. She just has a forthcoming piece on harmscapes, security governance harmscapes. And I thought this was really great. So harm is embedded within larger social institutions, governance failures, structural inequalities that create environments where harm is an expected rather than an incidental outcome. Harm becomes an ingrained feature of daily life. Hence this tying into kind of everyday security. And it kind of epitomizes what these climate harms are about. These are broader harm landscapes that impact on the everyday. Also kind of moving away, again normatively, from presuming the state is at the center of it. The state can resolve these problems. What if the state is complicit in these problems? Which very often it is. And again, it's just to kind of call for an incorporation of indigenous local knowledges. People who are most affected by this. Hence whole of society, not whole systems, not whole institutions, society. Those most affected by it. I mean, you could operationalize whole of society, it's a terrible word, but you could enact whole of society through a polycentric system. So I've also done a lot of work around polycentric governance and what that would look like. It doesn't mean bringing everybody together all the time to solve a problem. It's to really think, who knows about this problem and who can solve it? And very often we hand that knowledge to the state. Oh, the state can solve this problem, but they don't actually know about it. So you need some sort of flexible governance. You need systems that can be radically plural, informal even, hybrid, deinstitutionalized. You absolutely need to depathologize the non-state. There's just kind of an aversion to involving anything, the private sector. Of course they're complicit in it, but you could also harness that capacity. And in many contexts in the global south, the private sector is actually very important. And I think you need to, I use decolonize a lot, but you actually need to decolonize an understanding of order, what order is. Whose order, right? You need to reimagine, reconceptualize kind of dominant normative conceptions of what constitutes order. Again, referring to Brisbane's messiness, there's a messiness here that we need to embrace. We don't have a universal kind of map to deal with this because it's different everywhere you go. And again, this is kind of buying into the Southern Green criminology perspective of decolonizing our framings. It's uncomfortable not to have a plan, right? But it has to be context specific. It has to engage with the realities of what's happening on the ground. It needs to be radically contextual. You can't come there with a framing for all scenarios because it's going to change. Hence the need, again, for a whole of society approach. Flexible. And it also speaks to the fact that our expectations of foundational security differs from place to place. If climate harms are already pervasive in many global south contexts, their understanding of foundational security is going to be very different to us sitting here now. I have very little insecurities in this space. I mean, there's a foundational sense of security here, but in many contexts it's being challenged. And of course it's led to radical innovative solutions that are often ignored, again, epistemological blindness. And so you need to decolonize these normative understandings of kind of the state, the law, or the institution as the starting point for your solutions. And the Sustainable Development Goals is a very good example of a global normative framing. So many debates happening in southern contexts about decolonizing SDGs. But I haven't felt that yet. I haven't seen that. Yeah, I haven't seen that discussion happening yet. It's like a normative given. And most of the SDGs are institutional based or state based. And southern contexts are resisting. They're having these discussions. My South African colleagues have kind of symposium about decolonizing the SDGs. They're not appropriate. They're not appropriate in small island developing contexts. But this is our global normative framing, and countries are held to this, right? How can you move out of this framing? And then kind of finally, we need to, and this is just the post-humanist underpinning, right? We need to rethink our engagement with the non-human as being part of human assemblages when we think of a governance response. And this, again, draws inspiration from climate change criminology, the victimology aspect of it. We simply need to recognize kind of the socio-material harms as opposed to crimes. We need to recognize non-human as potentially actants. This is drawing from Bruno Latour's work. We need to realize again that we're part of an assemblage. And of course there's a spatial aspect to this in terms of biologically, from the micro to planetary, the macro. It's not just human to human local engagements. This transcends various spaces and time space, So again, this is a really messy problem, and you can't sit in a particular spatial moment to resolve it. Yeah, so this is my challenge. My challenge, your challenge, our challenge. If your normative starting point is anthropocentric, monocentric, state or institution-centric, crime-centric or criminal justice-centric, and some would argue criminology-centric, if you're in that vein, you're actually not going to be able to understand and respond to new everyday climatic harmscapes. You have to suspend these normative starting points Otherwise, you're just coming in there with a colonial framing and you're not going to be able to engage with the problem because it stretches all of our criminological boundaries, as I've kind of highlighted in the lines of flight. Thank you. That's me.